The air in the office of Mr. Abernathy at the Farmers' Trust and Savings was thick with the scent of stale pipe tobacco and quiet desperation. It was the smell Silas Blackwood had come to associate with the end of things. He sat on a hard-backed chair, his calloused hands resting on his denim-clad knees, watching the banker tap a fountain pen against a stack of papers that held the fate of 3 generations. "Silas," Abernathy began, his voice a low, gravelly hum that tried for sympathy but landed on condescension. "We've been over this. The note your father took out for the new barn roof and the hospital bills. It's 90 days past due. The board is getting restless." Silas didn't flinch. He just nodded, his eyes fixed on a faded photograph on the wall showing the bank's grand opening in 1928. Men in hats and women in long dresses, full of hope. His grandfather had been one of them. "I know it, Gerald. The wheat didn't yield what I'd hoped last fall. Too much rain in June." "Excuses don't pay interest, son," Abernathy said, leaning back in his squeaking leather chair. He was a man whose own hands hadn't seen a day of real labor in 30 years. "Frank Miller's wheat did just fine. He's already put a down payment on the old Henderson place next to you. Expanding. That's the future of farming, Silas. Get big or get out." The name hung in the air like a bad smell. Frank Miller. They'd grown up together, but their paths had split wider than a country mile. Silas believed in the land, in the sweat of his own brow, in owning a thing outright before you claimed it was yours. Frank believed in the power of a signature on a loan document. Frank's got a new John Deere 6600 combine with a 6-row corn head. "I'm running a rig my grandfather bought used in '46, Silas said, his voice flat. "It's a different kind of math." "It's losing math is what it is," Abernathy countered, his patience fraying. "Look, I like you. Your father was a good man. So I'm giving you one more season. One. You get this year's crop in, and you get this note paid current. Not just the interest. I want to see a significant payment on the principal. If you can't, well, the notice goes up on the courthouse steps come November. Understand?" Silas understood. He felt the word foreclosure wrap around his throat like a length of rusty barbed wire. He stood up, the chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "I understand, Gerald." He walked out of the bank and into the bright, unforgiving glare of a May afternoon in 1971. The heat was already rising in waves from the pavement of the town square. And that's when he saw it. Parked right in front of the bank, taking up 2 spaces, was Frank Miller's brand new pride and joy. It wasn't a combine, but his new tractor, a John Deere 4320, gleaming in the iconic green and yellow, the paint so fresh it looked wet. It had the optional sound guard cab, a space-age bubble of tinted glass with air conditioning and a radio, something so luxurious it seemed alien sitting on a tractor chassis. The big diesel engine rumbled with a deep, confident thrum, a sound completely different from the sputtering bark of Silas's old gasoline tractors. Frank himself was leaning against one of the massive rear tires, a wide grin splitting his face as he talked to another farmer. He was wearing clean overalls and a brand new seed corn cap, looking more like a salesman than a man who worked the soil. He saw Silas emerge from the bank, and his grin widened. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Frank called out, his voice loud enough for half the town to hear. "Silas, you in there begging old man Abernathy for another extension?" Silas felt a hot flush of anger creep up his neck, but he kept his face a mask of stone. He just nodded. "Frank, you ought to trade in that old museum piece farm all of yours and get yourself some real horsepower," Frank said, patting the huge fender of his new Deere. "This baby's got a turbocharged 6-cylinder diesel, 117 horses at the PTO. Abernathy signed the papers this morning, said it was the smartest investment a man could make. You can't make money with junk, Silas. You know that, right?" "My junk is paid for," Silas said, his voice low and tight. Frank laughed, a loud, booming sound that grated on Silas's nerves. "Paid for and worthless. You're sitting on 300 acres of prime bottomland, Blackwood. You could be leveraging that. Expanding. Instead, you're trying to farm like it's 1940. I heard you're pulling the old Thresher out of the barn again this year." "A Thresher? My God, man, my grandpa sold his for scrap after the war." Silas looked past Frank, his gaze settling on the horizon beyond the town toward his own land. He could see it in his mind's eye, the gentle roll of the hills, the dark, rich soil his family had tilled since they'd broken the prairie sod. He thought of that old Thresher, a McCormick Deering 2238 model, sitting silent in the back of the main barn. It wasn't just a machine, it was a testament. It had survived the Depression, a world war, and 50 years of hard seasons. It didn't ask for much: grease, a tight belt, and a strong arm to feed it. It didn't come with a monthly payment book that could strangle a man in his sleep. "It still works," Silas said, more to himself than to Frank. "Yeah, well, so does a horse and plow, but you don't see anyone doing that anymore, do you?" Frank scoffed. He pushed himself off the tire and walked over, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Listen, Si. When the bank finally takes your place, you come see me. I'll need a hired hand. I'll even let you drive the old 4020 sometimes, just so you don't feel out of place." He clapped Silas on the shoulder with a pitying smirk and walked away, leaving Silas standing in the shadow of the new green tractor, the smell of its diesel exhaust filling his lungs. He looked at the perfect paint, the spotless cab, the massive tires that had never touched dirt, and he knew it represented everything he was fighting against. It was a monument to debt, a shrine to the idea that a man's worth was measured by the size of his bank loan. As he walked toward his own truck, a 10-year-old Ford F-100 with a patch of rust on the fender and a loyal, sputtering engine, he thought about the choice he was making. It wasn't just about money or machines. It was about two different ways of looking at the world. Frank's way was all about the promise of tomorrow, financed by today. His own way was about honoring yesterday and making sure you could survive to see the sun rise. Before we go any further, I have to ask you folks listening to this, have you ever had to choose between the proven old way and the flashy new promise? Between the devil you know and the angel you have to borrow money to meet? Let me know down in the comments what you think is the smarter path, because Silas Blackwood was betting his entire family's legacy on his choice. He climbed into his truck, the vinyl seat hot from the sun, and turned the key. The engine turned over twice, then caught with a familiar, comforting roar. He pulled away from the curb, leaving Frank and his monument to modern finance behind. The road home was a long, straight ribbon of gravel, and with every mile that passed, the banker's threat and his neighbor's mockery solidified into a cold, hard resolve in the pit of his stomach. He'd show them all. The first order of business was the Thresher. It sat where it always had, in the dark, cool recesses of the main barn, covered in a thick blanket of dust and chaff that smelled of a dozen past harvests. It was a hulking beast of wood and steel, its big drive wheel and long straw conveyor making it look like some prehistoric insect asleep in the gloom. Most men would have taken a cutting torch to it years ago. To Silas, it was the heart of the operation. He spent the next 2 weeks giving it the kind of attention a man gives a thing he truly respects. He started with the grease fittings. There were over 50 of them, scattered across the machine's complex guts. He used a hand-pump grease gun, methodically forcing fresh, clean grease into every bearing cap, every pivot point, until the old, hardened gunk was pushed out. He checked every single belt, from the big, wide leather drive belt that would connect to the tractor's pulley, to the dozens of smaller canvas belts that ran the shakers, the fan, and the grain augers. He found one that was frayed near the splice and spent an entire afternoon carefully cutting a new length from a roll his father had bought 20 years prior, punching the holes with an awl, and lacing it together with leather thongs, just like his grandfather had taught him. The most critical part was the cylinder and the concaves, the spinning, toothed drum, and the stationary curved grate that beat the grain from the stalks. He opened the access panel and crawled inside the machine's belly, the air thick with the metallic scent of rust and dry straw. Using a heavy wrench and a steel punch, he checked the tightness of every tooth on the cylinder, tapping each one to hear the solid ring that meant it was secure. He found 2 that were worn down to rounded nubs. He didn't have spares. Frank Miller would have just called the dealer and had a new part delivered the next day, charged to his account. Silas couldn't do that. Instead, he fired up the forge in his workshop, a simple brick affair with a hand-cranked blower. He heated the worn teeth until they glowed cherry red, then hammered them out on his anvil, carefully drawing out the steel and reshaping the points. He quenched them in a bucket of used motor oil, the metal hissing and spitting, hardening the new edges. It was slow, painstaking work. It left his hands blistered and his face black with soot. But when he was done, the teeth were as good as new. Better even. They had his own sweat and determination forged into them. While the Thresher was being resurrected, he turned his attention to its power source, the 1951 Farmall M. The old tractor was the first one he'd ever driven. Its red paint was faded to a dull orange, and its narrow front end looked spindly compared to the massive four-wheel drive machines that were starting to appear in the county. But its four-cylinder C248 engine was as reliable as the sunrise. He drained the thick black oil, replacing it with fresh 30 weight. He pulled the spark plugs, cleaned the electrodes with a wire brush, and set the gap with a feeler gauge. He removed the cap from the distributor, wiped it clean, and filed the points until they were smooth and bright. He adjusted the carburetor, turning the idle screw by quarter turns, listening to the engine's rhythm until it settled into a low, even lope. When the day came to pull the Thresher from the barn, it felt like an event. He hitched the Farmall to the Thresher's long tongue and eased out the clutch. The tractor strained, the rear wheels digging into the dirt floor of the barn, and then with a groan of long-dormant axles, the big machine began to roll out into the sunlight for the first time in a year. His work wasn't going unnoticed. Neighbors would slow their pickups as they drove by, shaking their heads at the sight of the ancient machine sitting in the farmyard. The talk at the grain co-op was merciless. Poor Silas. His dad was a good farmer, but the boys lost his mind. Trying to compete with Frank Miller using that relic? He'll be broke by Christmas. Frank himself made a point of driving by one afternoon, not in his pickup, but in the cab of his gleaming 4320, pulling a brand new 24-foot disc. He didn't slow down, just laid on the horn, a loud blast that echoed across the fields, a clear sound of mockery. Finding a crew was the hardest part. Threshing wasn't a one-man job like running a modern combine. It took a team. A man on the tractor, two men on the bundle wagon, pitching shocks into the feeder, a man bagging the grain, and another stacking the straw as it blew out the back. Most of the able-bodied men in the area were already spoken for, hired by farmers like Frank, who could pay top dollar for less work. In the end, Silas assembled a motley crew. There was old man Hemlock, who was 75 if he was a day, but still had strong shoulders from a lifetime of farm work. There was Billy Ray, a lanky high school kid saving up for a car, who thought the whole thing was a grand adventure. And there was Silas himself, planning to do the work of 3 men. The first day of harvest was brutal. The sun beat down, and the air filled with a choking cloud of dust and chaff. The noise was deafening, the steady pop, pop, pop of the Farmall's engine, the high-pitched whine of the cylinder, and the constant roar of the fan. A canvas belt running the grain shaker snapped in the first hour. Silas shut everything down, sweated his way through, splicing it back together with a tin patch and some rivets, and got them running again 45 minutes later. Later that afternoon, a bearing on the main shaker arm began to run hot. He could smell it, a sharp, acrid scent of burning grease. Again they shut down. He had to pack it with fresh grease and loosen the tension on the belt, hoping it would hold until the end of the day. From his fields, he could see Frank Miller's operation on the adjacent farm. Frank's new 6600 combine moved through the wheat like a battleship, gobbling a 6-row swath, a single man sitting in an air-conditioned cab, listening to the radio. By the end of that first day, Frank had harvested over 80 acres. Silas and his crew had managed just 12. As they shut down for the night, covered in grime, their muscles screaming in protest, Billy Ray looked over at the Miller farm, where the combine's lights were still sweeping across the field, and said, "Mr. Blackwood, he'll be done by tomorrow night. It's going to take us 2 weeks." Silas just wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of a greasy hand and looked at the 12 acres of cleared land. "It's 12 more than we had this morning, son," he said. "Now let's go eat. Tomorrow we do it again." Against all odds, they did it. They got the crop in. The yield was decent, and Silas sold it at the peak of the market. He walked into the Farmers' Trust and Savings in late August with a check that made Mr. Abernathy's eyebrows climb his forehead. It was enough to pay the note current and put a solid dent in the principal, with a little left over. For the first time in a year, Silas could breathe. The next few years were a blur of the same. Hard work, long hours, and the constant quiet scorn of his neighbors. But something was happening in the world beyond their corner of the heartland. In 1973, the news was full of something called the Russian grain deal. The Soviet Union was buying American wheat and corn on a scale never seen before. Prices shot through the roof. A bushel of wheat that sold for $1.50 one year was suddenly fetching $4, then $5. Land that had been worth $300 an acre was suddenly appraised at $1,000, then $1,500. A wave of unprecedented prosperity was washing over the farm belt, and it seemed like the good times would never end. Frank Miller rode that wave like a champion. He was hailed as a genius, a visionary. The soaring value of his land gave him immense collateral, and he borrowed against it with reckless abandon. He bought another 320 acres. He traded his 4320 for a new John Deere 4630, and then, because one wasn't enough, he bought a second one. He bought a massive new Kinsey planter that could plant 16 rows at a time. He tore down his modest farmhouse and built a sprawling brick ranch-style house with a 2-car garage and a paved driveway. He built a new Morton machine shed so big you could park a fleet of semi-trucks inside it. He'd see Silas at the diner and clap him on the back. "Still messing with that old junk, Si. You're sitting on a gold mine and you're too scared to dig. I just cleared more profit last year than your whole farm is worth. You got to spend money to make money." Mr. Abernathy at the bank treated Frank like a visiting king, personally pouring his coffee and laughing at his jokes. He pointed to Frank as the model for the new American farmer, aggressive, leveraged, and profitable. Silas, meanwhile, stuck to his guns. The high prices were a blessing, and he used the windfall not to borrow, but to eliminate his debt. By 1975, he was free and clear. The farm was his, lock, stock, and barrel. The deed was in his safe deposit box, not the bank's vault. He used the extra cash to do things that didn't show on a balance sheet. He put a new roof on the barn. He tiled a low spot in the west field that had always been too wet. He bought a used but well-maintained Oliver 1650 diesel tractor from a retiring farmer down the road. He paid cash. It wasn't flashy, but it was solid, and it took some of the strain off the old Farmall M. To everyone else, he was a failure. A man who had been handed the opportunity of a lifetime and had squandered it. While men like Frank were building empires, Silas was just treading water. His wife, Sarah, a patient and loving woman, stood by him. But even he could see the questions in her eyes when another new, shiny piece of equipment rolled down the road to the Miller place. Were they being smart or just foolish? Were they being disciplined or just plain scared? One crisp spring morning in 1978, Silas was at the co-op, loading sacks of seed corn into the back of his F-100. The price of everything had gone mad. Seed, fertilizer, fuel. It was all double what it had been 5 years earlier. Inflation was a word on everyone's lips. He saw Frank Miller stride in, exuding an aura of untouchable success. He walked right up to the counter and signed for his entire spring operating loan without even glancing at the paperwork. "Just put it on my line of credit, Dave," Frank said with a wave of his hand. "Whatever the rate is, it is. The price of corn will cover it." As Frank turned to leave, Silas saw the loan document he'd signed sitting on the counter. His eyes caught 2 words printed in small type next to the interest rate. Variable rate. A cold knot formed in the pit of his stomach. It meant the bank could change the interest rate at any time. He overheard 2 old-timers, men who had farmed through the Depression, talking quietly by the feed grinder. "Heard on the radio the new fella at the Federal Reserve, this Volcker is talking tough," one of them rasped. "Says he's going to wring inflation out of the economy no matter what it takes." "What's that mean?" the other asked. "Means he's going to jack up interest rates," the first one said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Jack 'em up till somebody screams." Silas looked from the old farmers to the loan paper on the counter, then out the window at Frank Miller climbing into a brand-new Silverado pickup. Mr. Abernathy had driven out from the bank just to meet Frank at the co-op, and he was standing there, clapping Frank on the back, a wide, confident smile on his face. But for a split second, As the banker's eyes met Silas's through the window, Silas saw something else flicker there. It wasn't confidence. It was the frantic, high-strung energy of a gambler who had bet not just his own money, but the entire town's, on a single roll of the dice. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, but Silas felt a chill run down his spine. He could feel the weather changing. A storm was coming, a different kind of storm that no one could see on the radar, and he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that most men were too busy admiring their new barns to see that the wind was about to start blowing the whole damn thing down. The storm broke not in the sky, but on the evening news in the winter of 1980. Silas was watching the black and white television in the living room, a cup of coffee warming his hands, when the announcer's grave voice spoke of a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. The anchor talked of geopolitics and presidential resolve. Silas heard only one thing: the bottom falling out. The biggest customer for American grain was gone overnight. The effect was not immediate, but it was like watching a distant dam crumble. First, the futures market went into a freefall. The price of corn, which had been flirting with $3 a bushel, dropped to $2.50, then $2.20. Wheat followed suit. At the co-op, the mood curdled from boundless optimism to a quiet, gnawing anxiety. Men who had been talking about buying new four-wheel drive tractors were now whispering about how they were going to make their payments. Then came the second blow, the one Silas had been watching for. Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve, in their crusade against inflation, cranked the prime interest rate up like a man tightening a vice. 8% became 12. 12 became 15. By the spring of 1981, it was a terrifying 18%. The variable rate loans that had financed the Great Expansion became anchors, pulling farmers down into a sea of red ink. Frank Miller's empire began to show the cracks almost immediately. The first sign was subtle. One of his new John Deere 4630s sat idle in his machine shed for 2 weeks during planting season. The talk at the parts counter was that the turbocharger had gone out. A simple enough failure, but the part was on back order, and the dealer's mechanic, the only one certified to work on the new turbocharged engines, was booked solid. The final bill, Silas heard, was over $2,000. That same week, Silas's Oliver 1650 blew a hydraulic line. He drove into town, bought a new length of hose and 2 fittings for $30, and had it fixed in his own shop in under an hour. The next sign was the land itself. Frank had always farmed fence row to fence row, his fields pristine, every inch dedicated to a cash crop. That summer, a 10-acre patch of his soybeans on the north end turned a sickly yellow. He hadn't put on enough fertilizer. The price had tripled, and his operating loan from the bank was stretched to its absolute limit. He was cutting corners. Weeds started to appear along his headlands, something no one had ever seen on Frank Miller's property. Silas saw him at the gas station one July afternoon. The swagger was gone. Frank's face was pale and drawn, his eyes carrying the haunted look of a man who does his arithmetic in bed at 3 a.m. He was driving his wife's station wagon, not his new Silverado. "Heard you had some engine trouble," Silas said, keeping his voice neutral. Frank just grunted, not looking at him. Damn new machines. More trouble than they're worth. He shoved the gas nozzle into the car's tank with a vicious jab. Abernathy called this morning. Prime rate went up another 0.5 point. Said it was out of his hands. "My interest payment this month is more than I paid for my first tractor." He let out a short, bitter laugh that had no humor in it. "You were smart, Si. Or just lucky. I can't tell which." He didn't wait for an answer. He filled his tank and sped off, leaving Silas standing by the pumps. It wasn't a confession, but it was close. The breaking point came that fall. It was a wet harvest season, the ground soft and muddy. Modern combines, with their heavy engines and massive grain tanks, were struggling, sinking into the mire. Silas saw Frank's 6600, the machine that had once seemed so invincible, bogged down to its axles in the middle of a field. It took 2 of his big tractors chained together to pull it out, a process that took half a day and left deep, ugly ruts in the field that would take years to heal. Silas, meanwhile, was using his lighter, older equipment. He put the grain binder on his Farmall M, cutting the wheat and tying it into shocks, just as his father had done. It was slow, it was labor-intensive, but the old tractor, with its narrow tires, tiptoed across the wet ground. He let the shocks stand in the field for a week to dry. Then he hitched up the old Thresher. He'd hired Billy Ray again, now a young man home from college, and a few other neighbors who were desperate for work. They hauled the shocks in on wagons and fed them into the Thresher's hungry mouth. The machine hummed its old familiar song, spitting clean grain into the wagon box and blowing a golden mountain of straw onto the ground. They weren't setting any speed records, but they were working. They were getting the crop in, while Frank's multi-$100,000 operation sat parked waiting for the ground to dry. The day Frank Miller's world ended, the sky was a cold, unforgiving grey. It was a Saturday in late November of 1982. The auction notice had been on the courthouse door for a month, a stark white sheet of paper that signaled the death of a dream. Silas drove to the Miller farm, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of a sense of solemn duty, like attending a funeral. The yard was filled with pickup trucks and farmers in seed corn caps and insulated coveralls. They walked among the rows of machinery, their hands in their pockets, speaking in low, hushed tones. The equipment, once so gleaming and proud, now looked forlorn. The two John Deere 4630s, the massive combine, the 16-row planter. They were all lined up, tagged with lot numbers. They were monuments to a prosperity that had proven to be a mirage. Mr. Abernathy was there, his face ashen, his usual banker's smile replaced by a tight, grim line. He avoided looking anyone in the eye. He was not a villain, he was just another man caught in the gears of a machine he couldn't control. The bank was drowning in defaulted loans, and this auction was a desperate attempt to recoup pennies on the dollar. Frank stood by the porch of his brick house, his wife beside him. He looked like a stranger on his own land. He was hollowed out, a man who had lost not just his farm, but his very identity. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a booming voice, climbed onto a flatbed trailer and started the proceedings. The bidding was brutal. The crowd was made of vultures and ghosts, vultures looking for a bargain, and the ghosts of farmers who had already lost their own places, there to watch another man join their ranks. A tractor that Frank had paid $80,000 for just 3 years earlier sold for $20,000. The combine, with a sticker price well over $100,000, was hammered down for $35,000. It was a bloodbath. Frank flinched with every fall of the gavel, each one a hammer blow against his soul. Silas didn't bid on a single piece of equipment. He had no need for it. His own machines were old, but they were his. They didn't come with the ghost of another man's failure attached to them. While the auctioneer was selling off shop tools and fuel tanks, Silas watched the land values collapse in real time. The auctioneer moved on to the real estate, selling the farm off in parcels. The 320 acres Frank had bought at the peak of the boom, paying over $2,000 an acre, sold for $600. The home place, the original Miller family farm, went for even less. By the end of the day, Frank Miller's empire was gone, scattered to the four winds for a fraction of what he owed. Silas stayed until the very end. He watched as Frank and his wife got into their station wagon with a few boxes of personal belongings and drove away down the long lane, not even looking back. The new owners were already walking the fields, making plans. The Miller name, which had been on that mailbox for nearly 100 years, would be gone by Monday. Through it all, Silas's farm remained an island of stability. With no debt, the crippling interest rates were just numbers on the news. His costs were low. He raised a small herd of cattle, which provided another source of income when grain prices were in the cellar. He had a large garden, and Sarah canned enough vegetables to last through the winter. They weren't getting rich, but they weren't going broke. They were surviving. Their life was built on the solid rock of self-sufficiency, not the shifting sands of credit. The farm crisis deepened over the next few years, tearing the heart out of the community. More auction signs went up. The Farmers' Trust and Savings, overextended and insolvent, was forcibly merged with a larger bank from the city. Mr. Abernathy was forced into early retirement, a broken man. The town square began to empty out as businesses that relied on farmers' money, the implement dealer, the local diner, the hardware store, boarded up their windows one by one. It was a quiet, grinding depression that hollowed out a generation of farmers. And through it all, Silas Blackwood endured. The vindication, when it came, was not loud or triumphant. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1985 in the form of a dusty sedan pulling into Silas's lane. The man who got out was the new vice president from the city bank that had absorbed the old farmer's trust. He was young, wore a suit that looked out of place in a farmyard, and carried a briefcase. They sat at the kitchen table, Sarah pouring them both coffee. The banker laid out a file. It was for the old Henderson place, the 160 acres next to Silas that Frank Miller had bought first on his climb to the top. The bank had been holding it for 3 years, unable to find a buyer. It was a liability on their books, an asset bleeding them dry. "Mr. Blackwood," the banker said, his voice crisp and professional. "We know your position. You're one of the few operations in this county that's completely solvent. The board has authorized me to make you an offer. We need to clear this property. We'll sell it to you for $400 an acre, cash. That's below market value, but frankly, we need it gone." Silas looked at the man, then out the window at the Henderson place. He knew every dip and swell of that land. He'd helped Mr. Henderson with his harvest as a boy. It was good ground. He thought of Frank Miller's swaggering pride the day he'd bought it. He thought of his own quiet struggle. He had saved his money during the lean years, putting it away in a savings account that earned a pittance, but was safe. "I'll take it," Silas said, his voice even. He wrote a check from his savings account, a single slip of paper representing 15 years of fiscal discipline, sweat, and stubborn belief. He didn't borrow a dime. As the banker left, visibly relieved, Silas held the signed purchase agreement in his hand. It felt heavier than any deed. It felt like justice. A few weeks later, he was in town buying parts for his planter when he saw Frank. He was working at the lumber yard, loading bags of concrete into a customer's truck. He had lost weight, and the lines on his face were etched deep. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a weary resignation. He saw Silas and gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, then turned back to his work, his shoulders slumped. That evening, Silas drove his old Ford F-100 over to the small house Frank was renting on the edge of town. He found him sitting on the front stoop, staring at nothing. Silas didn't waste time with small talk. "I bought the Henderson place," he said. Frank looked up, his eyes showing a flicker of the old pain. "Heard you did. Good for you. Always was good land." "It's more than I can handle on my own," Silas said, though it wasn't entirely true. "I need someone to run it, someone who knows the ground. I'll pay you a fair wage, and you and your family can live in the old Henderson house. It needs some work, but it's solid." Frank stared at him, his mouth slightly agape. He was looking for pity, for charity, for the gloating he was sure must be there. He found none of it. He saw only a straightforward offer. A hand up, not a handout. It took him a long moment to find his voice. "Why sigh?" he finally asked, his voice rough with emotion. "After everything, all the things I said." Silas looked out at the setting sun, painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple. "Because you're a farmer, Frank, and a farmer belongs on the land. Besides," he added, a rare small smile touching his lips, "I figure you've learned a thing or two about variable interest rates. That's a lesson worth paying for." Frank Miller took the job. He and his family moved into the old farmhouse, and he worked the Henderson place for Silas with a quiet, fierce dedication. The rivalry was gone, buried under the rubble of the farm crisis. In its place grew a grudging, then a genuine respect. They were two sides of the same coin, two men who loved the dirt, who had simply chosen different ways to serve it. Frank's way had led to ruin, Silas's had led to survival. The community, what was left of it, noticed. The whispers about Silas Blackwood changed. He was no longer the backward fool who clung to the past. He was the wise man who had seen the storm coming. Young farmers, struggling to start out in the wreckage of the 80s, would stop by his workshop not to mock, but to ask for advice. He'd show them how to rebuild a carburetor, how to weld a broken axle, how to get by without a line of credit from the bank. He taught them that the goal wasn't to get big, but to stay small enough to weather the storm. Years passed, the seasons turned. Silas's son, James, grew up and decided to stay on the farm. One warm autumn afternoon, Silas, now a man with grey at his temples and the slow, deliberate movements of age, was in the main barn with his grandson, a boy of 10. They were standing before the old McCormick Deering Thresher. It hadn't been used in years, but Silas kept it greased and sheltered, a silent monument in the cool darkness. "Grandpa, why do you keep this old thing?" the boy asked, running a hand over the big wooden drive wheel. "It's ancient." Silas placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. The barn was quiet, smelling of old wood, dust, and the ghosts of 100 harvests. "This machine," Silas began, his voice a low rumble, "taught me the most important lesson there is. It's not about how fast you go, or how big you get. It's about what you own, not what the bank owns, not what some company in a city owns. What you own, free and clear." He looked past the thresher, through the open barn doors, to the fields stretching out under the afternoon sun. The land was his, the house was his, the machines, old and new, were his. "People will always try to sell you a shortcut," he continued, his gaze returning to the boy. "A newer, bigger, faster way to do things. They'll tell you that you have to take on debt to get ahead. But debt is a chain. Sometimes it's a light chain, and you barely feel it. But the man who holds the other end can always give it a pull, and when he does, you've got to be standing on your own ground." From the farmyard, they heard the familiar rhythmic pop, pop, pop of the old Farmall M. James was firing it up to go rake hay. The sound was steady, reliable, comforting. It was the heartbeat of the farm. Silas looked at his grandson, seeing the future of his family in the boy's curious eyes. "Remember that," he said softly. "This land isn't just dirt we own. We're just taking care of it. You build your life on what's real, on what you can touch and fix with your own 2 hands. You do that, and you'll never have to be afraid of the weather."